Hello, everyone, and a huge thank you for joining us today for a discussion on Is it time to shift cloud cost ownership left? This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Harness. Thank you, Harness, for helping make this terrific content available to the lead dev community. This webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which the panelists and I will head over to the Lead Dev Slack community to answer some of your questions in the webinar Q&A channel. We may also have some time to answer a few live questions, so please do submit those through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to them if we can towards the end of the session. So let's get started with some introductions. My name is Adrienne. I have been working with Lead Dev for a decade now. I'm a leadership consultant and previous senior manager, and I am joined by some engineering industry experts who are going to help answer the question, could developers hold the key to slashing our cloud bills? I'll ask each of our panelists to introduce yourselves. Fran, could you please start?
Of course. Thank you, Adrienne. Hi, thanks so much for joining, everyone. My name is Fran Hinkelmann. I'm an engineering manager at Google Cloud. My teams work on cloud runtimes and DevOps, including Cloud Assist. So I'm really excited about this panel to share my expertise on AI-driven cost management and optimization capabilities for developers. Back to
Awesome.
you.
Thank you, Fran. All right. We'll popcorn to Mike.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Wishanta. I'm a principal FinOps solutions architect over at Harness. I've been working with people for over 10 years now, since before FinOps was a term, helping them deliver better business outcomes with their public cloud environments through reporting, governance, visibility, and automation. So looking forward to diving into the topics today. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I can continue. Hello, my name is Florian. I'm a CTO at Threadflow, and I've been in tech leadership position for over a decade now, the past few years in different startups. And actually, the past 3 companies where I've been involved, we've had very successful cloud cost optimization measures. And yeah, I'm very happy to share my experiences with on the topic and yeah, hear about what everybody else has to share.
And I'll jump in at the end. So hi, everyone. My name is Luke Exton. I'm an engineering manager at Capital One and also have a role as a non-executive director at a company called Sums. I'm really excited for this panel because I get an insight into how does a huge enterprise work with cloud at scale, but also how does a startup looking to scale up operate. So I sort of see 2 sides of the coin when it comes to cloud cost and the impact that it can have on a business. So yeah, super excited to share my stories.
I love the range of experience on this panel. Thank you all so much for your introductions. So our conversation today is about how our developers could hold the key to helping our organization slash our cloud bills. Our developers could be the untapped resource that we need to track and reduce our cloud spend. After all, with a deep and native understanding of our internal systems, they're uniquely placed to build cost awareness into our architecture and workflow decisions. So today we're joined by a group of industry experts, experienced leaders who are going to share practical guidance on how to provide the culture, guardrails, and tooling that empowers our developers to rein in costs. We're going to be discussing practical strategies for baking cost visibility into workflows, where savings can be automated, and sharing our success stories. And as with other lead dev events, we want to make sure our focus is on sharing specific tactics and tips from our wealth of experience. We really want this to be useful for you by telling our real stories of how we've had success, how we've struggled, what exactly we did. Steal our playbook. So we've got a full agenda for you today, so let's jump right in. So I'd like to start by asking just a really fundamental question to kick us off. How do you build cost-aware habits into everyday engineering work? How do you bake it into your workflows and processes? Luke, can you help us kick off the conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. And this is super interesting to me because, like I mentioned, both sides of the coins, and to be fair, different strategies work at different scales. So, at an enterprise level, my observations really is developers generally are relatively detached from cloud spend, and they can maybe observe it through cloud accounts, but it's never really considered much of a priority. But as that scales, so does cost, and at some point, the business has to step in and say, "Whoa, we need to start managing this better." And a few things that we implemented that we saw significant gains from. First of all, is we essentially mandated cloud certifications, which essentially meant that developers innately understood the cost of the services they were using. So we made people much more cloud conscious. We also looked at how can we shift this thinking as far left in the design process as possible. So we looked at a lot of how we were doing our design reviews for our features, and we implemented an entire section focused on cost. Now, at scale, we had to add a threshold. So if we're increasing cost by $50, we're probably comfortable with that. But if we're increasing cost by, say, $1,000 a month, actually at that point, we want to be having much more of a targeted conversation on, are we building the right thing in the right way? And that has driven some really great conversations. Considerable things like maybe we were thinking about an EC2 lift and shift. Well, actually, that's probably then not been the right outcome. We've thought about things from maybe a more serverless perspective. Compared to a startup, that's been really interesting because it's a much smaller team and folks are generally from the off very aware of your cloud budget. And if you accidentally scale in the wrong way, that can actually almost put your company's balance sheet at risk. So every single feature, developers are thinking about what is this going to cost? How is it going to impact the business? And particularly in Sums, especially, we actually have a pretty good level of oversight. And I sit on their infrastructure subcommittee, which is a sort of a strategic pillar for their where they want to invest, and we scrutinize that wherever they invest. So yeah, basically any design review comes through at a subcommittee level, and just to make sure that we're adequately managing that risk. And that's me.
Love it. So, how did your developers react when you mandated the cloud certifications? I know I may have in our audience today someone I worked with previously who was thrilled when I made time for him to get cloud certification, his AWS certifications during the course of his normal work. That was 10 years ago, though, and you're adding it as a mandate. How did your team react to that? Were they thrilled?
I'll be honest, like it's a mix. Like some people were like, "Oh, this is great. We're going to get these certifications for free. We're going to get this time given to us so that we can learn." Other folks were like, "I'm pretty comfortable. Do I have to do this?" Which is a completely reasonable challenge. But yeah, I just sort of say to them, "Okay, maybe you don't do the foundational stuff. Maybe we'll look at like level one, more advanced things to really think about how can we better architect a system as opposed to have more principal understanding of how we use the cloud." But yeah, it was certainly mixed.
Yeah, you kind of had to sell it to the individual. Well, good thing there are tons of different certifications you can get. And can you tell us more, just a little bit of the nitty gritty on the shifting the thinking left and the design process? Like, can you just give us a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when at Capital One, when we think about how do we deliver software to customers responsibly in a very regulated environment, so we have to be very clear on like the decisions we're making and how we've made them and the other things we've considered in terms of what we eventually decided. All of our big features go through a technical design review, and at the part of that, that gets reviewed by our architects, it gets reviewed by our lead engineers, it gets reviewed by engineering managers, cyber, and various stakeholders throughout the business. And it's you can't go to prod unless you have approval, generally speaking. So it's sort of like that process stop gate that says this can't go live unless we've at least talked about this. And that at scale has operated really well, especially across the UK business. And I would, if it's a practical tip, definitely one worth considering taking away.
And now enforce is probably a bit of a hard word, but which level of leadership do you have kind of checking to make sure that that's part of the process? Is that something that developers are kind of checking each other as peers? Is this something you're asking an engineering manager to make sure is there? Is it something that gets to a meeting and then like, a VP has to notice that it's there? How do you call that out in your org?
Yeah, I mean, so our org in the UK is about like 3,000 people. Around 800 of those folks work in tech. orgs are typically split into like 100-person divisions. At an outcome team level, we essentially have like a head architect who is accountable for that process. But in terms of those folks who review it, like we have our lead engineers, our technical experts that will join those sessions as an expectation of their role to sort of provide us with the reassurance that the right thinking's been done and we're making some pretty solid decision making.
Love it. Thank you so much. All right. Any other thoughts on this one before we move forward?
Yeah, I think one point that is important to make is that I think it's not just cloud cost as an isolated thing, because there are simple things like latency or especially in serverless environment, you double the latency, you double your cloud cost. And so actually keeping track of different metrics, like things like latency, things like concurrency, and so on, the size of your storage, of course, all of these correlate to cloud cost. But they also correlate with good service. Doesn't really matter what it is, what the service it is that you're providing. And so I think it's really important to kind of correlate these, like, for example, cost monitoring with just general monitoring best practices, especially in a startup environment where we probably have much looser guidelines when it comes to like what's the architecture, what is allowed, and so on. We definitely also have a system that's evolving very quickly, and so being able to track these things to know, okay, so I have this system, it usually responds within like 50 milliseconds. What would happen to my cloud cost if suddenly I change something there? And yeah, so these kind of concerns, really trying to build better software in general, also leads to building more effective cost control.
Thank you, Florian. That's a great way of underscoring it for sure. All right, I want to turn it over to Fran for a moment. Fran, how do you leverage visibility and automation to empower developers to cut costs?
Good question. And even though I work at Google Cloud, we still have to look at our Google Cloud spend internally. Especially our CI is racking up quite a few resources. And even though it's internal, we still want to make sure we're not wasting resources just for the sake of running something. To gain visibility in your spend, I highly recommend obviously getting familiar with the billing dashboard, but then labeling and setting up allocations can really help to better understand where the money is going. It's also a little bit of a culture shift, enabling everyone or making sure all developers feel empowered to look at the dashboard and draw their own conclusions, setting up those alerts. And then probably the most important one in that culture shift is scheduling regular reviews and audits, just making sure, hey, that's at the forefront. We look at it regularly. Ideally, everything looks good and we can just move on, but keeping an eye on it. And for automation, lots of tools already available. Auto scaling, obviously, also very important for storage costs. Look at your lifecycle strategy. Is it feasible to delete assets after a certain while, or just keep a scaled down version? Like maybe you don't need those really, really high resolution assets of everything for all eternity.
Excellent. Other thoughts?
Yeah, auto stopping, lights on, lights off, scheduling resources on a schedule for non-mission critical, non-production workloads is something that everybody talks about wanting to do, but doing so at scale is incredibly challenging. And there's often opt-outs, right? If you're an enterprise and you've built this process either manually or purchase something to do it, you have to give people the ability to opt out because they need to be comfortable knowing that their resources are going to be there. So more often than not, even though a process is put in place, the majority of the infrastructure doesn't leverage it. So developing a strategy where you can ensure that there's availability of those resources when they're needed so that they turn back on automatically for those developers, whether it's a sandbox for a Sev1 incident or just something that they use, once a month. But when they use it, it needs to be there right away. So filling the gap in the availability challenge will help you actually achieve those really, really high or cost optimization opportunities for workloads that don't need to be 24/7, 365. And finding something that can do that or building it yourself is incredibly challenging.
Fran, I want to go back to you just for a moment. You are an engineering manager at Google. And so I want to ask an engineering management focused question. You said it's about a culture shift as well, making sure all developers feel empowered to look at the dashboard, know the resources, understand how to use the resources. How do you do that as a manager? How do you coach that? How do you teach that? How do you pair people together to learn that? What are some of the specific things you've done?
Good question. That I guess it kind of depends. Showing off examples, how other people use it, doing sort of mini training sessions, or making sure everyone knows where to get the information. Also really relying on a blame-free culture, like you're free to experiment. If you changing something on the billing dashboard causes an outage, it's not your fault. It's that somebody else missed. Like we need to have better processes in place so that doesn't happen. And then just general encouragement and leading by example.
Florian, I feel like from your work in open source, you might have some thoughts on this one as well. How do you help with that culture shift?
So yeah, I think just in I think yes, this part of taking ownership definitely makes a lot of sense. I think it's always really important to have the context, I think, for when we're talking about cloud costs, because like 100,000 euros of cloud costs might be like completely outrageous, or it could be business as usual. And then the same thing if you're talking about like storage taking like 10% of your cost could also be completely normal, could be also outrageous. And so having this like really like sharing not only like here's the cloud cost, but like also when you're working with multiple teams, sharing like the cloud costs across teams so that people can see what is their percentage, or what is the percentage or the ratios between different services, to see does it actually make sense for the system that we're building? Is it like maybe like, hey, 2/3 of our costs, it's all AI services, or maybe it's all compute, or it's all or very specific managed services that we see that are maybe just very expensive. And so seeing how things fit in relationship to each other, I think this is really super important.
Yeah, awesome. That speaks to the cross-team collaboration as well that we can foster there, and just a general wider organizational understanding. That's wonderful. Any thoughts on this one further, or we're gonna move on and hear a little bit more from Mike on how do you bake cost visibility into your workflows and processes? How do you help change team processes, the things we're doing day to day to help highlight costs? Mike, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, and I think this is a great transition because visibility underpins everything you need to do in the public cloud, whether it's one vendor or multiple. More often than not, it's going to be multiple based on business different use cases. Uh, so giving people access to the data is the first step, right? To Florian's point, if you don't know what you're spending, you have no idea what you're wasting. And the whole point of FinOps, and we'll talk about it later too, is giving people the information in the context that matters to them. If you're a developer or on the IT team, you're used to thinking in terms of resource size, core counts, memory capacity that's available, utilization data. But if you're in the finance team, you're looking at things by P&L or cost center. So how do you bring all of that data together and contextualize it so when you're looking at reports, you can all speak the same language? So democratizing the information becomes critical to have any level of success as you scale in the cloud. And often than not, where that data is going to come from is your tagging. So if you're tagging things or using naming conventions, you need a way of normalizing that data for errors, case sensitivities, things that aren't tagged properly. So you need to have a solution like Harness Cloud Cost Management, or there's a million out there now, to bring that information together so you can build just basic reporting. And once you build that basic reporting, you can build very customized dashboards and pull in data from different solutions into them, whether it's a Power BI dashboard or a Google Looker dashboard or a Tableau dashboard, pulling data out of your ERP systems, et cetera, so that people can come together and recontextualize the raw cloud bills, which would just break your computer if you tried to open them in Excel, and look at information and just to then figure out, okay, what's going on, and then providing access to people that need it in the context that need it. So Florian raised a great point. Well, you have a team, we want that team to have access to their reports, and whether that's by giving them access to the system that you've built or you've purchased, or setting up subscriptions and delivering the information to those stakeholders on a schedule when they need it. Get it in their inbox. Monday morning, Wednesday morning, Friday morning, when they're on the train, they log in, open their email, first thing they see, make sure everything's going well. From there, a lot of it's also going to come through with gamification, right? How do we incentivize these developers and these different teams or architects to understand what are the implications of the decisions they've been making? So a lot of customers I've worked with have had, optimization hack weeks, for example, where they've gone in and identified, all right, these are the 10 things that we can do that are low-hanging fruit, like deleting unused EBS volume or compute static IPs in Google that aren't associated with any resources. So let's get rid of them. Well, now how can we do that more programmatically? And that's going to be where governance as code comes into play. How do we put in place a foundation for how we want to operate as we continue to scale? And that can come into play regardless of the company size. It's about where are you experiencing the pain. I've worked with companies that have 15 people that spend 6 digits every month on the cloud. I've worked with companies with 200 people that spend $5,000 a month. But if there's challenges there's opportunities to put in place controls and rules to make sure that you're doing things as efficient as possible. So you're now managing by exemption instead of just looking at this black box of a giant cloud bill that's really hard to interpret manually.
Love it. I'm just capturing some of your quotes because I just love them. Asking, where do you feel the pain, can be a good guide on how to prioritize when moving to phase 2 after the low-hanging fruit. Love that. Other thoughts from the group on this one, especially practical things that you've done. Like, I love the hackathon.
I think the one of the points that was mentioned by Fran earlier about using labels, I think this is really a great practice, but it's also something that if you have somewhere a black hole, you know something is expensive, it's more expensive than you'd expected, and you don't know why. I think trying to make sense of things definitely is something worth investing time into. Because very often, and I've had the situation where we had one system that was a very expensive, big data pipeline, and pretty much everyone just assumed that it was meant to be that expensive. It was the biggest thing in the system, and then we, like, with one change, we optimized that cost by 90%, and nobody thought it was even possible. And then, like, once we understood where that cost was actually going, then, and that was something that was not labeled, then it's possible to identify that. So really, like, not accepting things that are unexplainable. I think that's something that helps.
Oh, I love that. I love these success stories. To the extent that you're able, is anyone inspired to share a similar win or surprise?
Just to add on to that, spend's not a bad thing if you can understand where it's coming from and what it's being used for. So if you see a large spike in compute VM usage, drill into it, investigate it, analyze the usage, what is it supporting? And if it's makes sense for the business, it's okay, right? So a lot of people will get sticker shock when they see their bills or their invoices, but having the ability to do that investigation is going to actually help you grow faster. So anecdotally, years ago, we were working with customers and they would save, this was back 2015, 16 in the early days of the cloud, 20% per month off their cloud bill just on implementing the solution. But what ended up happening was they started growing even faster after that because they knew where those costs were coming from and they could comfortably invest more and more in doing what they needed to do to be successful as a business.
Absolutely. So, with respect to engineering management, let's shift gears a little bit for the engineering leaders in the room. I want to ask a couple questions focused on, coaching developers and culture. Have you ever had to coach a developer into caring about cloud costs? How do you make it real for them as something to care about? I know we've touched on it a bit, but I want to give the floor to Florian to talk about how you've done this.
Yeah, so I think optimizing cloud costs it's actually a very vague task because as Mike mentioned, actually cloud spending is a good thing. I mean, we're buying valuable resources here, and so just trying to optimize that is not necessarily a good thing, or trying to reduce that is not necessary. It could be a compromise that's not worth making. And then there's a lot of different parameters. Maybe we want to increase the cloud cost so that we have like better latency. We want to better service, or we can scale faster. So there's a lot of strategic thinking that goes into that, and I think this is really something that's super important is when coaching people to give them the right context. I think there's one very simple question that I've asked sometimes. It's just like, okay, so you know how much 1 hour of this service costs and so on. So you know the cost. What's your own time worth? Like, and then if people see, okay, so I have like my own salary cost, like let's say 100 euros an hour, and then I have this one optimization that could save like 100 euros a month. Is this worth doing? Maybe, maybe not. But it definitely puts the things into the right consideration. Like, what are we getting in for the time that we're investing? And even just like breaking down to just the simplest use case or the simplest scenario where it's just like one person's own time without considering like the team and the impact on everyone else. I think that sometimes puts people in the right context of like, where is it something that is like, where do we draw the line? And this line about what is worth optimizing will change over time, because maybe something that like costs us like, let's say 100 euros a month, then you like a few months later you have 10 times more customers, it costs 1,000 euros a month. A bit later you have 100 times that, and then suddenly it's definitely absolutely worth optimizing. So there's a lot of thinking about like what are the repercussion, and yeah, definitely thinking about how things change over time. So thinking about like the linearity, like without needing to go into like too much mathematics and big O notation or these kind of thing, just thinking, okay, so if we were to have 10 times the number of customers that we have today, what would happen? Which part of our cloud bill would like grow tenfold, and which parts would stay exactly the same? And I think that this is really trying to think, how does all of this kind of like, what's the mechanism, what's the logic of how these costs will behave? I think that's really the thing that that a lot of engineers are sometimes missing when they first get their like first cloud optimization task.
Yeah, so there was a lot there. So I just kind of want to tease it apart just a little bit. And, maybe go over some pieces and double click on one piece that I feel like is particularly salient for this group. So you kind of started by saying, one way you can make it real for an individual is to talk about the cost of a service versus like the cost of, their personal cost per hour as an engineer. Then something that you said that I thought was really intriguing and relevant was how you said that this presents an opportunity for strategic thinking. There's a lot of strategic thinking that goes into optimizing cloud costs. And then that makes me think more of like a path to leadership. So when you think of like a leveling matrix, right? Strategic thinking is not in the early career developer, part of the matrix, but as you develop and as you level up, it definitely is. So I just love to hear you or another member of the group talk about, that being a path toward, maturing as a developer is kind of thinking ahead, as you were saying, like, what would this service look like with, 100,000 more users, for example?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, it is definitely a big, well, it is sometimes a challenge when working with more junior people in the team. But I've seen this is also something that a lot of people are very excited to work on. So it can actually be something that can be a gateway into kind of more strategic thinking. And then, yeah, it's something that I've enjoyed quite a bit, working with people and kind of like asking questions about like, hey, what will happen and so on, and pretty much reviewing architecture decision together with people. But yeah, I think it is something that helps people grow and is at a certain level is definitely an expectation to have this kind of skills.
Awesome. Thank you, Florian. So, kind of on a similar theme, I'd love to move on and hear from Luke. So, with respect to that leveling matrix and performance management, could it be possible that an engineer taking a significant role in reining in cloud costs be a promotion path for that engineer? Could it be points in their favor on the framework, or should it just be something that's simply expected? Maybe 10 years ago, it was, a real standout. And now today, it's in these more cost-conscious times, it's just something that should be expected. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and multifaceted, I think. I don't think I'm at a point where I can say my organization is expected. For me, particularly when we're referencing engineering maturity and folks who are thinking more strategically, that indicates the level of maturity for me. And that I typically see in much more senior developers and folks who go on to be staff engineers, etc. I personally want to reward engineers that sort of step into the fray and say, hey, we can do this a lot better. They challenge assumptions and say, well, we can do this faster, cheaper, and present solutions. Here's how. They're ultimately people I want to elevate. When I think about like an enterprise scale, we have a cloud ops team. They are really pretty good at managing what's already there, but they don't really have the time or the technical depth and understanding of our systems to understand actually how can we optimize and how can we be better and deliver better outcomes for customers. Like I really value folks who work with architects and apply their own experience and their technical thinking and essentially get coaching from architects to think about, look, I think there's a lot of opportunity and or room for improvement here. Like, what are your thoughts? What are the things that you want to be thinking about across that stack? So yeah, using the team around them. And ultimately, like I reflect on the type of culture we've tried to build in Capital One, which is build it, own it. When we think about our guiding principle for budgets, almost, and there's a level of like balance here, but if you imagine it's your own money, how are you spending it? Where are you investing it? Why? And that for me, when I've been coaching developers especially, has made people completely rethink that this isn't a nebulous figure that doesn't matter. Actually, no, if this was my business and this was my money, how would I be treating it? Where would I be making the investments? And I reflect on a really recent piece of work that we've been working on, which is we've had a big on-premise acquisition system. And one of the simplest things we can do is, hey, we've got a bunch of old stuff. Let's lift and shift it into EC2 instances. We'll get it in the cloud. We say we've achieved our cloud migration objective, and we're done, right? But realistically, like the volume that we have and at scale, like the costs would absolutely rocket. And engineers who I will say have now made up to level 5, so that's like senior manager level over where we are, we've absolutely elevated through their decisions they made around actually, no, we don't just want to do an EC2 migration, and we want to think a lot more strategically about where we want to go with this platform, where does the business want to achieve in terms of what products do we want to offer, at what scale, to which markets. And that ultimately resulted in us building a much more like managed system, using event-driven architectures, and ultimately just like achieved a really cost-efficient platform that at the minute now is sort of looked to as this is the example of how you can do it. So yeah, super proud of the team that achieved that.
That's fantastic. That's definitely what I was getting at with the strategic thinking opportunity there. So thank you so much for fleshing that out a bit more. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to move on to Mike for our final planned question for the session, and then we're going to hop over to our live Q&A. So Mike, from a perspective of improving cross-team collaboration and breaking down silos between departments, what have been some of the wider benefits of your engineering teams taking on more ownership over cloud spend?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really is the FinOps story and why that culture has become the de facto method for managing public cloud across teams. Cloud financial management governance, cloud cost management and governance were all terms. Cloud ITSM for the cloud was kind of how it was originally bred for all these tools like Harness, from a governance and cost management standpoint. But FinOps has become the strategy that people have adopted because it brings people together, you form a cross-functional organization, and you put things into the context that matters for the business. You're looking at things by cost center, you're looking at things by application, you're looking at things by line of business owner, who's ultimately responsible for it, whether that's an individual developer or a team or an engineering manager. You need to create transparency because transparency leads to more responsibility, and more responsibility leads to better accountability. So you need to make people accountable for their consumption and their waste. And you need to put in place controls, which are why solutions exist. And this is something Capital One's pioneered with Cloud Custodian. You need to put in place solutions that prevent that from happening in the future, because otherwise you can spend a month where every developer on your team just focuses on optimization. But if you don't change the process, 6 months later, you're exactly where you were today. So how do you put in place governance that leads to better outcomes for the business while still giving you the flexibility to achieve the promise of the public cloud, right? When I started in the space and I told people I worked on cloud optimization, people thought I talked about, I helped people delete storage from Dropbox. No one knew what it was. But as it's evolved and now everybody knows what AWS is because they sponsor every sports stat that exists, you need to have an understanding of, all right, here's what we're actually working towards. We want to make sure that we have the resources available for our production workloads. We want to automate lights on, lights off of mission critical, non-mission critical, non-production workloads. We want to get out of the data center, especially with everything going on with a certain hypervisor company, right? There's a lot of reasons to now migrate even faster to the cloud, but how do we do so efficiently, right? So Luke's story he just told about refactoring an application that made sense for the cloud. A lot of people aren't doing that. They're just lifting and shifting over, and then they're wondering why it's not cheaper, and then they're trying to understand, well, do we need to go back on-prem? And it's you need to help yourself fail fast but succeed more, right? Build fast, fail fast was the model of the public cloud, but how do you fail less? How do you learn from your mistakes? And how do you iterate on top of them to make sure that you can actually achieve better outcomes? And that's where people, processes, and tools come together to help you drive those outcomes. It's why I joined Harness. I'm really excited about the shifting of FinOps left that we can help achieve. But it's a challenge that everybody has. So I don't want to belabor the point, but it's about efficiency, it's about accountability, and it's about making sure that you're doing the right thing for the business so that everybody has an understanding of what's actually going on in the context of the media. So finance can actually go talk to a developer and they can speak the same language as opposed to just not understanding each other at all.
Absolutely love it. Thank you so much, Mike. Let's turn over to our questions. Mike, I did have a follow-up for you, but hopefully maybe we'll have time or we can continue the chat in Slack. If you look under Q&A, we have a question from Casey Wireman, and I think Luke is going to take this one. Luke, do you mind kind of restating the question back before you answer it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Casey's asked, how do you justify the potentially expensive upfront technical investment to your business and stakeholders when balancing the business desire for new features with the need for strategic architectural shifts? For example, migrating to ARM for cost savings. I mean, this for me is like the classic business conundrum with cloud migration and target architecture. And I think it's something that I think even in enterprise don't necessarily always get right. Where I've seen the most success in this space is a lot of it's through relationships. So what language are you speaking to the business, and like how are you framing your proposals? There is a level I sometimes find with like honesty around this as well. So it's that balance thinking of is this a must? Is this a need? And I would touch again on like Florian's long-term strategic thinking that he described, like how will this scale and how much will this probably be a problem in the future? But really, I'd seek to spend a lot of time working with the stakeholders to understand like what do they need to hear in order to this to really resonate. Because I've worked with exec that just care about cost and they're not really interested in like how is this going to impact the level of product that we can offer our customers, right? So for example, this would be we can only offer 100 products on this platform. If we invest here, like we can start offering twice the amount. Actually, how much does that matter to them? For example, anyone want to build on that? I feel like there's going to be some good builds.
It's something we see a lot at Harness. Like our mission is to help developers be more productive and get code to market faster so you can drive more revenue, among other things. So there's a cost implication to everything you do. You need to understand what those costs are when you're making changes. So IACM tools become critical and having an understanding of, all right, what's this particular change I'm making as an individual and then scaling out more broadly as a team going to impact the bottom line? But what's the impact on the business, and being able to communicate that to the right people so that everyone feels comfortable investing and iterating more.
Awesome. Let's turn it over to Florian for Michael's first question, and then that will be the final live question of the session. We will pick the conversation up in Slack.
Yeah, so the question has to do with the ratio of costs from between prod versus dev. And I've seen actually a lot of possible differences. Sometimes dev, like in fully serverless environment, dev almost costs nothing because there's just no traffic, and it has exactly the same setup for auto scaling as production. The only difference is that because it doesn't get traffic, it scales down to 1 or maybe even to 0. And then the only difference in production, maybe we have a minimum of like, let's say three concurrent instances. So that's one situation where you could have a dev environment that costs almost nothing. And then on the other hand, sometimes with like very data processing heavy and data investigation heavy setups where pretty much in your dev environment, you also need to have all the data, you need to be able to run everything. And then just because this is where there are new versions are being tested and so on, it actually ends up being more expensive than the production environment. So I think there's definitely there's a lot of a pretty broad range that's possible there. I think personally, I'm always been a fan of moving to production faster. Of course, I mean, it works in the right kind of context, but that also means moving away from these dev environment and keeping these dev environment really disposable. I think that's this is one thing that I think is often underrated. Like the cloud is all about like, hey, you get things on demand, but I think actually being able to get rid of things very quickly is probably one of the biggest assets of the cloud. And yeah, I think these various tools that make it possible to use the same setup for production and dev with different behaviors. I think these are really key to being able to really optimize the cost of the dev environment. But as Mike mentioned earlier, putting these kinds of systems into place, depending on the system that you're dealing with, can be quite challenging.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you, panelists, for your amazing insights today in our panel. We're all going to head over to the Lead Dev Slack now in the webinar Q&A channel. So please head there to continue the conversation. We'll be posting some questions in there. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you had a great time, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one.